So I think originally, oh sure. So like the thing that we originally wanted to talk about was direct democracy, right? You said like bring back the republic, and I was like, nah, fuck that, direct democracy time.
Yeah. I'm pretty pro representative democracy. Um, Now, what I'm clear, like what you clarified in your position, I think we might actually
Hmm.
have more agreement than disagreement here. So I think it'll just be a pretty
Hmm.
interesting conversation. Because normally when I'm
Sure.
talking to people who are talking about direct democracy, we're talking about like the Chomskyist, like sort of anarchist, no unjustified hierarchies, all
Hmm.
direct democracy, which I disagree with because I think there's a lot of problems that come with that. For instance, we already have lower voter turnout, and I think making people have to, which this, I don't think this is exactly what you think, but this is what they will normally
Hmm.
say, is like we should vote directly on policy. And I think that becomes problematic because, well, one, if we already have lower voter turnout because oftentimes people don't know exactly who they're voting for or what they're voting for, I don't see how
Hmm.
bringing in the complexity of policy is going to at all help that. If anything, I think it'll make people more afraid to vote because they won't know exactly what they're voting on. Which, of course, we could argue, well, we could educate people up to a level where they could actively be more effective when it comes to voting on policy. Um, Things like that. There's a few other arguments that we could fix to then have direct democracy. But my question then comes to that is like, well, if you can do that under representative democracy, then why
Hmm.
would you need direct democracy, right? Um,
So, well, that's so. I think the arguments for direct democracy. So, for one, I'm in favor of mandatory voting and like a whole bunch of other stuff to kind of force people to engage in democracy. So, I'm totally okay with like basically like mandatory education to action to like participate in voting and so on. Um, so, I'm not opposed to a lot of that. The arguments, the best arguments I've seen for direct democracy are about like representation. So if you have mandatory voting, so everyone turns out, and you have direct democracy, then it tends to be much more representative of the population as a whole than just does like representative democracy. And this is true even without mandatory voting. There's this stat that I think in like California's like propositions, the vote is like 40% or 50% non-white, but California's legislation is like 20. I'm sorry, like its legislators are like 25% non-white. So there's this enormous shift towards like the poor and like women and like minorities, people who don't usually get representation, in actually getting representation in like direct democratic votes.
yeah, I mean, I haven't really seen any stats on that, but I'll take your word on it because I trust you. Yeah, I just think like one of the things
Bad
though
mistake.
when we, oh, I'm believe we're talking in good faith, so it's all good. Yeah,
Hmm.
I think though one of the problems that comes, of course, I actually also agree with mandatory voting. So I think we have some common ground there. I just think some of the education that would be required in order to understand policy and its complexity,
Hmm.
um, is at a level where you almost kind of end up counteracting some of the benefits you get from democracy, like increased freedom and whatnot. Because now there's this sort
Hmm.
of requirement to be even higher, like even more like highly educated when it comes to politics and things like that. And I just
Hmm.
don't. It doesn't seem
And you
that
want people to have
people
like the freedom to be dumb, more or less, that you want it to be like the
freedom so
choice to
they
participate.
can, well, not even necessarily just participate, but to understand policy at that like
Hmm.
level where it's not just a politician's vision. You have to spend a lot more time, actually engaging in policy itself, not just like what a politician says they want to do, right? The vision that they're selling you. And I think like, sure, I guess like the freedom to be dumb, but I just more mean to have the freedom to spend that time doing things that they prefer to do with the small existence that they have.
I mean, so the argument that I have there is, so there's this guy called Darren Acemoglu, and he does a lot of economics writing about good institutions. And one of his big arguments is that you tend to have much more democratic and like strong institutions when there's like broader societal participation, when there's like more organizations, when there are like more people engaged in parties, more people engaged in just like political activity in general. And so I guess my concern is that I think all else equal, I would generally prefer like removing some of people's freedom to like not participate, not be knowledgeable, and have them be like very active in the democratic process, just because it makes it more likely they will safeguard democracy itself. Like I'll take like a 2% reduction of freedom for like a safeguard of 50% of freedom or something.
Yeah, so I mean, I would agree to that to like an extent. I just think that the level at which we're trying to educate people for direct democracy, voting on policy directly. And when I'm talking about this, I'm talking about like outside of republic, totally outside of representative democracy, every policy is being voted on. The level of education necessary for
Hmm.
that seems to me to be more than 2%. If we wanted to say we wanted to mandate voting in, like, say, a representative democracy, like we wanted
Hmm.
mandated voting, like you have to go vote for the president, right? Sitting out isn't an option. I'm totally fine with that, and I think like the education needed there is just enough to be observing what is happening politically, and from there you have enough information then to cast a vote that seems to be knowledgeable enough. While on the other hand, I disagree with the idea that how much education would be necessary to vote on policy directly would only be like 2% taking away freedom, you know?
So my suggestion there is, so there's basically the way that I perceive direct democracy is as trying to provide checks on when representatives get too far out of line with what the general populace desires. So like in representative democracy, this also occurs to some degree. If people get far out of line with people's desires, they'll elect new representatives. But if you have direct democracy, you can be certain that it will be the case, even if it's not like a great representative system, like if the parties are corrupt or something, so long as the direct democracy is followed. So like the way that I perceive of this is like, let's say so like to give a little context, my argument is that what I would like is I think that instead of having, say, like one presidency, because presidential systems are much less stable than like parliamentary systems, it'd be good to have like a horizontal or dispersed presidency, many like councils that are each in charge of one area of the economy and society. Like you make you do direct elections to like a council that runs Department of Health and Human Services, for example. They're like the health department. You just directly elect them. And while you're directly electing them, you'd also vote on a direct ballot to determine what policies they'd enact. Like you'd vote on a ballot to do single payer healthcare. That's more or less what Switzerland does. And so you don't have these very nuanced policies. You have like pretty broad policy prescriptions, like should we stay on multi-payer or should we do single payer healthcare, sort of stuff.
Okay, so I mean, I guess I wouldn't fully disagree with that, but I almost kind of wonder. I don't think that really gets outside of being in a republic, though, right? Like, because if you have all a republic is having representatives, which you described as the council, and then you kind of have an added portion where you're basically giving the direction that the council should be going in, right? And to me, that I would agree with that, but I don't think that's outside of representative democracy. It's just
Well,
making representative democracy more democratic, which I'm totally fine with.
so I think the extension here is that's not just giving them direction. It would be like legal direction. Like they can't choose not to follow it, right?
Yeah, sure, sure. But like the way that it's actually being, which this is my main reason for being for some sort of representative democracy, is the
Mhm.
expertise to then write the policy that gets enacted and deciding whether that
Sure.
policy is good is in the hands of the council that you described, which would function in a sense as representative democracy would. It's just more, we want to do this thing, and this is what you guys who represent us need to do. And I think that's fine. I think that's still technically a republic. It's just a more democratic republic, which is what I'm for. I'm totally for making our
Sure.
republic more democratic. But it,
So
yeah, go ahead.
sure, sorry. So I don't think there's too much disagreement per se. I think the argument is just more like so this gets a little bit into the discussion of technocracy and democracy we were going to have, right?
Oh yeah,
So
yeah.
like I think that one of the distinctions you could do, for example, is with representatives, especially if you had these sort of like siloed representatives, like you're directly electing someone in head of healthcare or something, you could directly demand that they have like an expertise in healthcare. Like everyone who gets elected needs to have a PhD in like public health or something. Um, I, it doesn't need to be that specific requirement, but you can just set requirements there and like do technocracy more or less. Um, but with direct democracy, that doesn't occur. And so one of the concerns in voting in representatives, and this is something that Paul Cockshott raises, is that representatives tend to be like better educated, which is maybe a good thing, but they also tend to be like higher income. They tend to be whiter. They tend to be men, and so there's these like disproportionate representations of what they actually do, assuming that people with these backgrounds vote differently, and a lot of studies seem to suggest that they do. So there's this concern basically that there are just these like innate biases to getting elected. Oh, actually, there's this really interesting one I saw in Finland, of all countries. They were doing some direct democracy, and they did studies of people based on their health status. And so people who have like very severe health issues basically can't run for office, but they can vote direct democratically. And so it like ensures that they're properly represented in a direct democracy rather than just in like a pure representative democracy.
Yeah,
So
sure.
that's the argument for like strong direct democracy.
Yeah, I think when with some of those issues, like I think like the example you used, like they tend to be wealthier and whatnot. I think there's ways we can fix that through like publicly funded campaigns and whatnot. I think there's other regulations that we could add, but at the end of the day, you could still have like you get the pluses of these people being educated and whatnot. You just
Mhm.
have a way of making sure that the representatives themselves, because this is
Mhm.
okay. Do you know Zizek? I'm gonna pull a Zizek argument if you know Zizek by any chance.
I Go ahead and hit me.
Okay, so Zizek's thing, it's kind of a joke, but I agree
Mhm.
with the sentiment. It's the idea that you don't want to be spending all your time in these meetings or constantly reading over
Mhm.
policy and whatnot. So I think that's where you get um, the benefit from representatives. They get to deal with that. And I like the idea that you proposed earlier about like giving the like we want to do like a single payer, like the people get to decide
Mhm.
that, and then these representatives or whatever have to do that job. And then I think like you get the education from that. We can put, like you said, like maybe you have to have a PhD or a master's or whatever in this certain topic to be able
Mhm.
to write things on that. And I agree with that as well. And I think like we could also talk about public funded campaigns and whatnot or whatever that then get rid of that wealth gap as good as we possibly can. And then things like I can't think of a certain policy currently, but I'm sure there's other ways that we can deal with like different groups of people that these representatives represent, right?
I mean, so there's some of it. I know. So Cockshot is I don't know if he's quite a reformist, but he's okay with like electoralism and some degree of reformism as an ML. And so he's talking about the Soviet Union, and even within like I don't want to like like eulogize, not eulogize, like what's it, give a hagiography to the Soviet Union, but it was like a highly equal society. And so it's very unlikely people would already have a lot of wealth coming in or a lot of income coming in. And yet he demonstrated that as you would go up the layers of Soviet democracy, you were more and more likely to get like the managerial class. You were more likely to get the high income even within Soviet society. Um, so I guess my concern is just it seems like this is something that you can never quite eliminate, and with direct democracy, you can make sure that this never quite occurs. That there will always be like a genuine democratic representativeness, um, no matter what.
Yeah, I suppose. I guess just for me, that the main contention just lies with when it comes to direct democracy. Like I said before, I think like we could do mandated voting to get rid of the problem of voter turnout, like we were discussing. But still, that problem exists within itself. The populace not being like that educated when voting on direct policy, and I just think if we can fix those problems with a representative democracy, to me, it doesn't really seem like there needs to be a direct democracy. And also, I believe that the representative democracy allows the freedom of people being able to spend their time doing other things other than engaged
Sure.
within the political system all the time, which I think is something that
Well,
we should focus on. Like I'm for like the idea of the government being able to run in the background without people having to constantly being like partaking in that. Like like right now, obviously we want more everyone being super engaged because we literally have a proto-fascist or whatever in office, right? But there's times in which we kind of want people to just be able to do whatever they want to do and the government to be able to take care
mhm.
of things. And I think that's easily done under a representative democracy than a direct democracy where you have to constantly be engaged with that political system.
So one of so I agree there is some freedom to have like to not be constantly engaged with the government. I guess my concern is that you see these low turnouts, and there's a stat I want to say like New York Times or Pew Research did something recently where they showed that only like 1% of people are quote unquote truly politically engaged, meaning that they are like actively engaged in trying to get candidates elected. And it seems like there's just lots and lots of evidence that having like really vibrant trade unions and mass strikes and like democratic action is important for maintaining democracy. And so I would much like if like mandating voting and having direct democracy makes people even slightly more likely to like move in the direction of like participating in society, I would much rather have that and significantly increase the chance that democracy withstands like I don't know a Trump fascist coup or something. Um, that's
Sure,
basically
I
like
guess our
there's a
main
weight of
just
freedom you got to do.
I guess our main difference is just you want people to be engaged in the political system as much as possible, which I do think is important when we have things like you said, like a Trump coup or whatever, right? Like I totally agree there. I just think that there are times in which it would almost be a burden to have to be that politically engaged in times where like things aren't as crazy as they currently are. And I kind of think that what we should be trying to achieve, in a sense, is a good government that sort of runs in the background. And I think that would be most beneficial to people. Um, but I don't think we disagree
Well,
very much, because I
sorry.
would agree with a lot of the reforms that you would bring up that I think can be applied to representative democracy to make it better without bringing about the burden that I laid out earlier.
So one of the so are you yourself a socialist, would you say, or
Yeah,
stockman?
I'm socialist, communist, whatever.
Okay. So one of the this is we'll get back to direct democracy, but brief move away to get into something. Like how do you fund, say, media and art and these sort of like cultural production? I think it's called like cultural industry or culture industry. How do you fund the culture industry under socialism or communism?
Well, I would assume publicly, right?
Well, sure, but I'm saying like how do you decide, say, that artist X gets money but not artist Y, or news station X but not news station
Well,
Y?
you brought up Paul Cockshott earlier, and Paul
Hmm.
Cockshott in his model, right, has a way to get demand, and figure it would function in the same way that we would do any other commodity by figuring out the demand of said commodity.
Sure. So then you're just suggesting like so Cockshott's way of getting demand is so as I understand it, Cockshott's way of getting demand is similar to Lange Lerner. It's just looking at what people actually consume. So fundamentally, you'd be just doing market mechanisms for media production.
Yeah,
So this seems problematic. Like there's a lot of evidence that publicly funded media does better, in part because it can avoid stuff like clickbait journalism and like just constantly pursuing the bottom line.
yeah, but wouldn't this still, like, in a sense, be publicly funded just by seeing what the people are like?
It's funded by the public, but it's funded by the public according to like supply and demand. So therefore, if you get the most clicks, then you get the most
Okay,
money.
okay,
So you get
I see what you're getting. Yeah, yeah. I mean, I guess that could be problematic. So I guess in a way we could probably just do it in a way where we allocate. I don't know what system you function with, if you're talking about like labor vouchers at this point or whatnot, but you could then theoretically put some of those towards those industries, right? That don't then rely on the supply and demand model, right?
well, that's part of the suggestion. It's that unconditional public funding is good on the one hand, but then so labor vouchers, like just giving them to people and then letting them choose the fund media, um, would be decent. It would at least be people funded. One of the suggestions I was trying to move towards is: are you familiar with what's called like democracy vouchers in, say, like Oregon?
No.
So in Oregon, I want to say they mail each person come election season, so every 2 years, a like $20 voucher that they can give to one candidate. Um, and the benefit of this is that it gives everyone a roughly equal voice. If we assume that like elections were only publicly funded, then it's like a genuine democracy in terms of how many votes people get.
Okay.
So the suggestion is that you'd want to do something pretty similar for like media production. It's that there would still be some degree that people are like choosing which ones succeed and which ones fail, and to some degree it would be based on clickbait. Um, but the argument is like you want some way to fund media in a way that isn't controlled by the government. You want a way for people to independently choose like which stations to fund.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I get that. I haven't thought too much about how we'd fund media, other than I had like one conversation about this with someone forever ago.
It's okay.
I guess like for me, I'm not too worried about the government being able to fund said media, because at this point, if we're in socialism, we're letting them control all
Mhm.
of production, right? And if we're going to assume that they're going to do something awful with media,
Well,
it kind of would have to apply to the rest of whatever is being produced, right?
Well, but if so, that's kind of the whole point. To me, that seems like extremely frightening. You should want like if you're going to give the state this much power, you also want to give like a huge amount of checks on state power, like having lots and lots of parties, like having lots and lots of independent media. And so I guess just the point I was trying to move towards is a bit like I I guess I should have just gone more directly to it. Is like, uh, it, do you want, say, like a way to like punish fake news? Like how do you maintain that like a good like ecosystem? Like say for example like YouTube and Twitter, right? Now that you've got GovTube and GovDir or whatever, um, how do you decide who gets banned? How do you decide whose rights should be violated? Essentially, rights to like put stuff on the platform.
Sure. So if these are government owned, I assume it'd function sort of like laws, but for those things, like a government decided TOS, right?
Well, sure, but I guess that's what I'm saying. Like, how do you decide that the TOS is valid?
Well, then if we're going off of something like representative democracy, you would vote in representatives that would then make the TOS for that, right?
Sure. So I guess uh, this is one of my arguments where I think that the media is so vital to like having independence from the government that I think you basically need. Um, so if you've read Cockshot, are you familiar with the concept of sortition?
I'm not. I vaguely understand cockshot.
That's fine. Sortition is just like he points out this is what they did in ancient Greece. So they'd have like everyone come down to the public square and they'd randomly draw people's names on who would like do the jury for a day. And so my suggestion is there are certain positions that you don't want to have representatives in charge of. You just kind of want average citizens to be in charge of, so that there can't be a concentration of power in like a political party. So the suggestion is that for stuff like, say, who gets to decide if like media practices are fair, maybe even stuff like voting practices are fair, my suggestion is that you do sortition. You pick like, say, 10,000 people out of a hat and you have them decide the policy. So bias could come in the selection process if it's not random, if people are like being selected unfairly. But that's more or less the same problem that you'd have with representatives. So basically my point is there are certain institutions which I think are so vital that I'd like to take away, like I'd like to have it be just direct democracy for making sure they're functioning well.
Okay, I mean that makes sense. I'm not like against the idea of direct democracy in some areas. So like I guess in that sense, there's a
Mhm.
pretty good good argument for that, and I think that's fine. I just think like generally, like
Mhm.
overarching, representative democracy functions better. But of course, there's definitely going to be
Sure.
like areas that I think direct democracy can be definitely useful. Like I'm like kind of a nuance bro on this. I'm pro representative
Okay.
democracy, but when it comes to like certain areas, it's totally possible that a direct democracy would function better there. My main argument is just that overall a
Mhm.
republic seems to be better, and of course we could add areas in which we think direct democracy would function better, right?
Sure. I mean, so I guess the areas I'm suggesting that direct democracy is necessary are institutions that like help decide who gets elected and kind of like a backstop to every representative position as like a way to make sure they're actually following public opinion.
Oh yeah, no, I'm totally for that actually. One of the things
Oh,
I presented whenever I talk about
democracy pill.
yeah, when I talk about representative democracy, oftentimes I'll talk about we
Mhm.
need a really good way to build a recall or check representatives, right? Obviously, if they start
Mhm.
oppressing groups, there should be a way to get them out of office. I totally agree with this. I just think the idea of having representatives takes the workload off of the individual, and I think that is like so beneficial. But obviously, yes, there are ways that we should reform a republic in order to
Mhm.
function more democratically. Like I said before, I'm totally for a more democratic republic, but still
Mhm.
the overall structure of a republic seems to be super helpful.
I know lots of people don't know this. Most states in the United States, most positions in the United States do have recall elections. You just need to get enough
Yeah,
signatures.
yeah. I talked to someone about that recently, and I was like, "Oh, that's interesting. I think we should do that more, or make that process easier, or whatever." Right?
There- There's this big, I forget the concept for it. Back when I read more direct democracy literature, there's this concept of like barrier to vote, and the higher the number of signatures is, basically the harder you're making it for people to do direct democracy. So one of the suggestions that you could do is you could have positions have like automatic recall elections, more or less. Um, like let's say you had a position like the senator, like a senate, like you had like a representative body that has a multi-year term. You could have an election say each year, and you could do a recall each one. Um, that would, for most people, like incumbents almost always win these things. There's like an incredibly low loss rate to these sort of things. So it would still keep more or less the regular electoral schedule, but it would allow people to recall justices that they felt, not justices, like representatives they felt did something wrong.
Yeah, yeah. I'm totally for that. Like, because I just think whenever I talk about republic, like whenever I made that tweet or whatever, where I was like, uh, embrace the republic, or whatever, I was one first going after like anarchists who are totally for like complete and
Mhm.
utter horizontal organization, and
Sure.
two, but I like the main thing that I think is super beneficial from the republic is the structure of having those representatives. I'm totally down, like you said, to
Mhm.
have some way to make sure that these representatives can be checked and make sure they're following the will of the people. I just think like overall that structure, it just increases people's like freedom to do other things that they want to do.
Mhm.
It
Mhm.
just takes the workload off of, to make the Zizek joke again, it keeps people from having to be in meetings all day.
Well, I know. So one of the Zizek's broader points with that is that he argues people are happier when they don't know quite how like good or bad they have it. They're like a little bit ignorant and they're just like blissfully unaware. And there is to some extent like psychology research which suggests that. I forget what I think there's something called like the impact bias, where people think that something will have like a big positive or negative effect on their happiness. But most people just learn to be happy with literally whatever they have, and making them aware, like if they were if you were really poor and every day you had to see a picture of how like rich people were, it would actually make you quite
Yeah,
sad.
it's the whole thing. Like, if we all live in dirt huts, we're more happy, and uh, if we all live in dirt huts, we're like happier. But if one of us lives in a dirt hut next to a mansion, we're gonna feel pretty bad if we live in that dirt hut, right?
Yeah. And so this gets into like concepts of to me, this is why you shouldn't base policy on like happiness per se, um, because this is just like, to me this is like human irrationality. Um, it, like people should not be quote unquote like as happy living in like a highly equal but destitute life than like a somewhat unequal but like much richer life. But it's like a reality we have to live with, I suppose. So
Yeah, yeah, I would agree. I think like the thing, I'll have to find the lecture. I'll actually send it to you when I find it later. Because it's a really interesting talk that Zizek has when he talks about this. And he kind of like it's called like a plea for bureaucratic socialism or whatever. And it's this just it was basically the argument I was giving earlier, where I was saying like being able to
yeah,
have the government run in the background takes the workload off of people, and it allows people to then pursue things that they would get like greater enjoyment out of, instead of having to keep their nose in like policy all day, or pursue like political science at a level that most people just do not care to do.
yeah.
But that's basically my main position, is just that I think the structure of a republic is good. I'm totally for making it more democratic. If that means instituting some direct democracy here and there, that's fine. I just think the overall structure of a republic is like super solid. Um, yeah.
So I want, so why don't there's kind of like two directions we could go on this. One is I very much am in favor of kind of the making people actually extremely aware of politics. I more or less want people to like have a vote every month. I want mandatory voting. I want people to get paid to like go to like debates about politics, to go to like public fora about politics. So we could talk about uh, like my hyper forced democracy or whatever.
Yeah.
The other
Okay.
thing, I think the other critique of like anarchism is that it's usually highly confederal. You talked about it being horizontal. Confederal would mean like there's no federal government, there's just local communes. And I think the other thing we could talk about is just like the failures of anarchist communes is that they keep having these extremely local decision makings, and so you can't get these benefits from having like really large decisions over enormous areas and like the economies of scale that result from that.
Actually, yeah, that would be really interesting, because I asked on Twitter recently what people wanted me to talk about, and they wanted me to talk about anarchism because I have issues with the anarchism.
Sure.
Yeah, I
Why
think
don't you start with your strongest critique, or sorry.
yeah, so one of the things, well, first, having, well, I'll go into this. So, oftentimes, you brought up the communes. They'll often talk about having communes or whatever, and I think a real problem
Mhm.
with having, like, a nation, if you will, like, put into a bunch of tiny communes, and this idea that they're going to just function in harmony is just a fairy tale to me. Because if we look at nations, for instance, which would just be a larger scale of this, and the way that they exploit one another based upon what resources they have available to them, I don't see
Mhm.
why that wouldn't result at a like level of communes. Like, it just seems like that seems to be a natural thing when we're having more separation, right? Like, if we're having nations that are separate, they're going to try and
Mhm.
compete with one another. And when you bring that down to the commune level, now you have that times like 100. You have a ton of communes that are then trying to exploit one another for their own good. And I just think that that's
There
like,
was, sorry.
yeah, I just think it's kind of childlike to think that that'll actually like function well.
I was just gonna say that an even stronger version of that, even if we assume that all the communes are like working together, they aren't like gonna invade each other. There's like security forces maintaining the peace somehow, that all those sort of things. Um, there's these incentive problems where, let's say you've got the commune of like oil well number 5 in Saudi Arabia or something. Their incentives to produce oil are very different than the incentives of almost every other commune on Earth to avoid global warming. Um,
Exactly.
and so
Yeah.
there's lots of problems with like coordination across communes unless you can force one commune to do something. Like for example, under federal system, you can just pay people not to extract oil. Like, yeah, we knew you were oil workers. We're laying you off by force and we're paying you to like get a new job or something. But if you have a local commune and they're only like product is one thing, which is often the case for local, like especially rural areas. They have one or two products, and you're like, nope, we're banning coal production. They're fucked.
Yeah, I would totally agree. It seems like it would sort of implode on itself, either one from communes exploiting one another, or like you said, them having totally different interests that ends up harming the other communes, and it just totally gets rid of any sort of like a cooperation that exists because there's just so much separation between these areas instead of some sort of like um unit, like some sort of like thing where they're functioning together. Yeah, I kind of stumbled on myself, but yeah,
Yep.
I totally
So
agree.
sorry. Someone in chat said once competing firefighters would start to operate, they would realize that the best policies would be to include services provided for free to everyone in their area. So I don't know if they're saying things about like ANCAP or like ANCOM, but the same sort of issues apply. It's that if you wanted that to just start with the efficient like fire production at the larger regional level, you could just start with the larger regional government, like a federal government. You don't need to just hope that the communes happen to work together. Um, the argument that they would present is that communes would be incentivized to work together because it's better for them if they do like freedom of trade. One of the things that I thought was really interesting, I recently watched a series, this will sound odd, on the Bronze Age collapse. And I realized how like scarce some resources are across the world. Like the Soviet Union, I want to say produced like 90% of the world's tin during the Cold War. And the US really wanted it for its stealth fighter planes. And there was a similar problem with tin production in the Bronze Age collapse. There were only like I want to say like 3 mines of tin, and there were only like 10 mines of copper that were active in the Bronze Age area. So the polities that had control of this had like near total dominance of politics. And you can imagine similar things in the modern era for like silicon and uranium and all these sorts of scarce resources. I don't actually know if silicon is scarce, but let's assume it is. Or what's the thing that they say people are like taking over Bolivia for, like the battery thing?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I think that's something you totally run into, which is what I was trying to say when I was talking about the exploitation. It's like you have a commune that ends up having um a ton of this certain resource that is then needed somewhere else, and then they have so much leverage over the other commune, which is why you need some sort of like federal, like government to come in and be like, hey, okay, we got to get this resource there. You can't like literally exploit all the resources from this commune because they need that bad or whatever. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, it's like a two-way problem. It's that simultaneously the communists that don't have the resources might realize like if we don't take control of these resources, they're going to screw us over in the future because when we do need them, they'll have all the leverage. And so unless they have like a strong incentive to cooperate, it's hard to see it all working out. This is actually so the origin of money is not like sorry, that was unclear. Economists have this fairy tale about the origin of money, which isn't true. It isn't true at all, but it's useful for the points of this discussion. The idea is that let's say that we want to trade something. I have like 10 chickens and you have like 10 cows, and neither of us wants to trade because you don't want my chickens and I don't want your cows or whatever. We could still trade using money because it represents like abstract value. And so there's this problem that if you're talking about coordination between two communes, they might not have anything that the other commune wants. Let's say it's two agricultural communes. What are they going to trade? They both have food. The only reason they trade is if there were like a localized famine. Um, and so this is basically a problem that you'd only be able to foster cooperation via trade between like cooperate communes that had some actual reason to trade.
Yeah, I totally agree. I just think it's really weird that people think that this cooperation will just simply exist when, like, we don't see that in any other like fashion. Like I pointed to like nations, and you used the example of the USSR, for example, with the US or
Mhm.
whatever. It just we can look at sort of what that would look like. Just we have a nation scale instead of a commune scale to look at that, and it's obvious that they don't just cooperate. They have to have a reason to cooperate, and when they can, they will actively exploit the other one for their own benefit. And I think a lot of the problems that we have in society will not be gained through like decentralizing to that level. If anything, I think it's the other way around. I think centralization creates some sort of unity and a common goal that we can then work together to like figure out a lot of these
I mean,
things.
so this is the argument for federalism, right? It's that you have some degree of centralization, some degree of localization. Um, and in particular, if you wanted a world government, you'd probably need like maybe 3 layers of government or 4 layers of government between the bottom and the top. Um, Just because you don't want to like ignore people's local like desires. And one of the things, again, I really want to support is like participation in politics. And people feel much more strongly participating in politics if they feel like they're actually represented, which is much harder if it's like a distant central government rather than the local government. So there's some benefits just to having local government, just for the appearance sake of making people feel like they're involved in politics.
Yeah, I mean,
uh,
I think to an extent you
Having
always have
strong
to have.
fact having parts, of course.
Yeah, I definitely agree. To an extent, you have to have some sort of local government. Actually, this kind of links back to direct
Based in
democracy. I
Fed
think
pill.
local
This guy's a
government.
Fed, okay.
Sorry, what?
I said based in Fed pill. This guy's a Fed.
Well, yeah, I mean, like I think like
Yeah,
local governments are
federalist.
important because, like you said, it creates participation there. I also just think like when it comes to direct democracy, one of the places that I thought it could actually function pretty well is something local. Um, and of
Hmm.
course, obviously this stems to centralization, but I always think there has to be that central body in order to unite all of these different areas together. Because if you don't have that, if you go the full like Confederate route of just a bunch of communes, it just
Hmm.
completely falls apart. There's like no unity there, and I think like when there's none of that, a lot of the goals that us as like if you're like a leftist of any kind, a socialist, whatever,
Hmm.
all the goals that we have just cannot be achieved in that way. I don't think.
So I know one of the things that really concerns me about local communes is ethnic and like religious and racial and all these other hatreds. So like within the United States, I know some anarchists will say, before we do anarchism, we'll need this long period to like equalize incomes and abolish racism and so on. And maybe that would solve it. But if we did like anarchism in the short term, we're talking like next 100 years, it's really hard for me to believe that there wouldn't be animosity based on like previous colonization or income distribution or race or religion, just because we've seen so much of that in the present society. Like I think recently, I want to say Vox or the Atlantic or something did a story about um, there was this one town in like North Carolina that elected a black mayor, and a local like white mob like pillaged like the town hall and like killed it and burned it down and created their own like
That's
separate government.
awful. Yeah, yeah. No, that's so true. Because okay, I come from a very conservative background. My town is like, what's the guy's name? I can't remember his name, but he's like one of the most like red representatives we have. Uh, Louis Gohmert, that's his name. Um,
Oh no.
he's just awful. And the thing is, when you start looking at communes, you have to take in what the
Mhm.
local like culture is there and how different groups would be affected if they ever like took step in that commune, or if that commune then knew of a different one that had a different demographic, and the sort of like social relations that you would have there and how those could be possibly problematic. For instance, like my old town is like pretty like racist. It would not be good if they could like self-govern to the level of being like their own commune, because I guarantee the laws they would pass would be highly racist.
Yeah. It's like about, if you want to have some degree of equality of like human rights, you need some way to impose human rights even when people don't desire it.
Yeah, totally.
Like basically one of the problems we were like, even in representative democracies, it's clear that sometimes people like elect bad leaders or like populist leaders and like destroy local democracy unless you have some way to like force them back to democracy, more or less. Like there will be over time this degeneration of the communes. Um, this is like a problem with lots and lots of like local confederalist theories, but um,
I totally I
these
totally
are all
agree
very.
with your critiques of communes. Because I went through like an anarchist phase and believed in that, and I thought about it pretty hard for more than 2 seconds, and realized the consequences of that are not very good
Yeah, the consequences
whatsoever.
of communism have been a disaster for the human race.
Yeah, totally agree.
So Stumbled Up in chat said, "Would an anarchist society still not have a constitution that prevents racism?" So I, they might,
Yeah,
but
like
doesn't
a commune
constitutions are just paper.
could, but like it doesn't necessarily mean that they would, or they could try to have one that united each other, but like I don't see that happening. And if they could, even if they did, I mean, like you said, I think you said it was like a piece of paper. I mean, like there isn't anything really
It's all
enforcing that.
questions of like enforcement. Yes, yes. It's that there's this discussion. I'm not getting the terms right, but that like for any right, any like freedom you have, simultaneously there's like the legal right and the enforcement of the right. You need, for any given right, I think the idea is you need both like the law to say that you have the right and an agent to actually make sure you have the right. Um,
Yeah, and this kind of gets us
Otherwise, there's
into
no real harm.
the critique of the monopoly of violence, which anarchists have a problem with. But that is what keeps all of our laws in place. Without that monopoly of violence, there are no laws. Like that is the way that we enforce our laws is through that.
I mean, fundamentally, yes. And it's about it's partly just about enforcing like cooperation over time. There's this neat book called The History of American Law, and one of the things I think is really neat about it is it documents very early origins of contract law, which would sound odd, but before, like, I want to say the 1840s, there just wasn't contract law. People just did contracts based on faith and like verbal agreements. Um, and if they like screwed up really bad, they would like either sue each other or try and ostracize each other from the community or have like a family feud spanning generations or something. And the reason it all kind of worked is that most trade, most work tended to occur in the same communities. But as you increasingly move towards this industrialized society where you have people doing business deals with someone 1,000 miles away that you've never met in your life, never will, and you can't really affect their reputation because you don't know any of their friends, you can't hurt them. You need these like arbiters, more or less the state, to enforce that both of you are going to actually follow through on this contract. Um, so it's basically this problem that to actually have enforceable contracts, to have like secure property rights, as the Americans desired, and to have like secure communes and freedoms, you need someone to enforce those laws.
Yeah,
So
it's absolutely necessary. Like I don't know if you're like, I'm sure you are, the two different definitions of state. You have like the Marxist definition, which is like the
mhm.
class antagonism, and then there's the anarchist definition of like just the monopoly on violence. And I'm a socialist. Obviously, I'm kind of against the Marxist definition, but like I just think it's kind of um, crazy to think the idea of getting rid of the state and the anarchist sense of the monopoly of violence is at all something that's realistic or desired because of the fact that
Mhm.
we can literally do nothing else. Like, if we want to have some sort of civil rights, for instance, that has to be enforced through a state apparatus. If you get rid of that state apparatus, that is just, like you said, it's contingent on like faith. Like, we have to just hope that people decide not to like start enslaving people or killing people based upon race or gender or identity of any kind, right? It seems insane to me.
Yeah. No, it's very difficult to believe, and like I think that part of what we've also seen is that generally it hasn't been practiced, so we don't have any empirical examples of it working. Like even the quote unquote anarchist, like Rojava, for example, had representative government and central, like a federal government. Um, that there really just are no like examples of local communal rule.
Yeah, and then you can look at the CNTFA, which people like to point to, which is like the same thing, and also they had tons of problems that show it didn't like function very well.
Yeah. Anyway, um, so now that we two non-anarchists have debunked anarchism, okay. Um, I guess yeah, this conversation wasn't quite as contentious as I thought. It sounds like I have a slightly more democratic representative pilled you.
Totally, totally.
Oh, I guess the last thing we could talk about the other thing. So my argument is that I really want people to participate in politics. So I am totally okay with forcing, not forcing. My suggestion is um, there's this book called The Emergency State. And one of its suggestions to improve democracy is that you have a quote unquote democracy day where you have like public fora and debates where people debate about like who to vote for in, say, a given election. And so I really like that concept, in part just because we're seeing like an epidemic of loneliness and people are like sadder and more like alone than they ever have been. So I'd like to some degree to like encourage people just to talk to each other. This is one way of doing so. And it'd also be nice if they were politically active. So my suggestion is you do one direct democracy vote a month. You elect one council a month. So let's say you've got like 48 councils. You're doing one each like month for 4 years. And then you're doing one direct democracy vote, and you're also getting paid, say, like $20 to go to a public forum. So my suggestion for this one is it's opt in or opt out. You can choose not to get the $20 or whatever, but you don't have to.
Yeah, I mean, I'm whenever I say like I don't want people to have to like spend all their time engaging to the level to vote on direct policy itself. I'm just
Mhm.
saying that the level that is required to do that. I'm not saying in general people shouldn't at all be politically like informed or participate whatsoever. I think yeah, like debates like you were saying or whatever, like having a democracy day, that's probably a good idea. Especially I like keeping it opt in opt out is probably a good idea as well. Pushing people to like take part is also good. My main point was just more I don't want people to feel like they have to be constantly engaged in politics, like us mentally insane people who decide to spend all our time
Mhm.
talking about
Mhm.
politics. But yeah, I mean, I definitely agree that we can definitely do things to promote people to at least pay attention. My main contention was just the level at which it takes to like I don't know, read through like a huge policy and completely understand what's going on, which is what my contention with pure direct democracy in the more like anarchist sense was.
Sure. I mean, I guess the only argument I would raise is I think the as people get more and more educated over time, I think the argument that like it's an imposition on people to participate in direct democracy gets harder and harder to make because now they've already got a higher and higher baseline.
Sure.
Um,
The only thing I would say to that is, do you not think policy would probably become more and more complicated as time went on?
yes and no. I mean, I'm sure policy is more complicated now. Um, But in general, I think that the rate of education has probably increased much faster than the rate of increase of complexity of policy. That could be untrue. I don't know. Maybe I need to think about that more. But
Yeah, I'd want to look in that too. That would be my main thing. It's just the worrisome about like as
sure.
um as the world gets more complex, as long like say we have like a world government or whatever, as more
Mm,
parts get thrown into what we're putting into policy, the more complex it's going to get, which is going to require even more knowledge on said topics. I think. Now you may be right. Education may catch up and like surpass that, but that would be my main like worry is that as people got more educated, so would be the matters that we're voting on, right?
yeah, that's fair enough. And I guess we just have to hope, right? This would also be a problem for representatives, unless the representatives are get. I guess the representative have a benefit because they're like solely focused on the policy, but their education level is also increasing, just like the rest of society. Um, there was actually, again, a book that would be interesting for like the intersection of democracy and technocracy is called, I think it's called Diploma Democracy, which just notes that like in most modern democracies, we've seen this enormous expansion of people who have degrees. Like I think the U.S. Congress has like 99.75% of people with degrees or something absurd like that.
Yeah, that's actually really cool. I'm gonna look at that book, research it.
Um, so I guess I don't have too much more to talk about. I think this wasn't a very confrontational conversation. We'll have to find something that we can brawl over.
Yeah, I'd be
Uh,
down. I think we basically agree. I think like the way I phrased republic is confusing to some people because I'm for a more democratic republic. I think we both kind of agree on that. That we both kind of want a republic that maybe has more direct democracy or is at least more democratic. Am I right?
yeah, pretty much.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I think we settled that then. Well,
All right.
thanks for
So
letting me
before you
chat
go,
about this.
nope, before you go, make sure to shill yourself. So I forgot to
Okay.
do it at the start. Tell us like who you are, what your channel is about, where we can reach you, so on.
Okay, yeah. I'm isocratic. You can find me on YouTube at isocratic. And Twitter as well. Yeah, I make political content similar. I'd say we make probably kind of similar stuff for the most part. But yeah, that'd be awesome if y'all would check me out.